Hey Ryan, how's it going?
Not too bad at all. Jason, how you doing?
Good to see you again. What kind of stuff you got to show us today?
Listen, I was on vacation and I feel like I might still be, how we talk about multimodal or multimodal. I feel like I might still be stuck in vacation mode. So apologies that this episode took so long. But I think on that segue, what I'd like to talk today is about command line or CLI editors and how you could bring your own model to something like a Claude Code or maybe a Codex from an OpenAI or Gemini CLI. It's a bit hacky, I'll say in the beginning, but the project I found was essentially through looking at that vibe coding platform that I've been talking about before. I've been looking for a lot of projects in this space that are either BSD, MIT, or Apache licensed. I came across one a while ago, I think it was 3 months ago now, called OpenCode. It was pretty early days and things weren't that great when I went to try it out. And there was a bit of a weird fork that happened, I think about a month ago as well, that made it a little bit difficult to figure out how to use. But what happened was on vacation, there was a model that came out of OpenAI called GPT-5, and I really wanted to try it. But then in the back of my brain, I'm like, do I really want to try a new tool? Cloud Code does exactly what I need. Why would I try something else? And I ended up trying it in Windsurf, but it's really not the same. Cloud Code, certainly to me, and I think maybe to you, not to put words in your mouth, seems like the way to do things now. It just, in terms of the amount of work required or the amount of work required to go back and fix things, it seems to have all the features and none of the bells and whistles that I don't use in order to just get things done. So if I have an idea and I want to get it outputted, Cloud Code is that hammer, that tool that I'm reaching for all the time. Does that sound about right for you as well?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, it
Oh,
is definitely the hammer that works on all nails so far that I've come across. Sometimes you have to pay a little extra for that solution, but
right.
yeah, so far, and I've had the exact same like thought as you. Is I love Claude, but sometimes, or sorry, I love Claude Code as like a tool, but you get the models that are just Anthropic models, which is going to be Opus or whatever Claude Sonnet probably model. And so those are great, but there's other stuff out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I recall, I think it was a couple months ago now, Kimmy K2 came out for it. And again, I was thinking, oh, great, looks free. Maybe I could play around with this. But at the end of the day, I don't think I did anything. I didn't even touch it. Somebody else played around with it. It's a pretty big model, so it's difficult to host. I've got an open router key, which we'll talk about in a moment here. So I can try out a bunch of different models and playpans, or maybe I could go Hugging Face. But at the end of the day, when I want to get work done, I keep reaching for that same tool. Now I've tried other ones. I had yet to try Codex just because I'm not on that plan. But we've talked about Gemini CLI before, which is open source. We've talked about Aider as well, which started off as a CLI tool, but it was also a plugin for your IDEs as well. There's one out there called Amped that I've not tried. And I'll talk about Charm Crush just a little bit briefly because it is a fork of OpenCode. And then there was some confusion around the naming of the repo or what have you, but there's really not that many tools out there. I will spoil this thing a little bit. I'm going to be comparing this to Cursor CLI, which I've also yet to try, but I'm really interested in what this TUI or text user interface looks like when it comes to code, because I'm constantly in the command line anyway. And this is where I feel like I want to work. I don't need to be mousing around or playing with different views. A lot of times all I need is maybe not that chat window, but the progress window, or maybe looking at what agents are doing. So I'll quickly share my screen here and we'll look at Claude
Okay.
Code first,
Yeah.
and then we'll swap over and look at OpenCode because they really do look very similar. So pardon me while I share my screen here. And if it stops sharing at any point, please do let me know. Sometimes that happens when I'm playing around with resolutions and things like that. So in here, you can see that I've got Claude Code. We can scroll through. There's some stuff going on. Now, this session is extremely long. By that, I mean, I've been using this for possibly 2 weeks. So there's a lot going on. And in particular, you can see when I go to resize things, this will happen, which is not great. Now, Claude Code is pretty powerful. Like I said, the TUI itself could use some work. There are some third-party tools that I'll try to talk to at some point in time that make this a little bit better. There's different wrappers, essentially, for what the front end looks like, because it doesn't always need to look like this just text UI. But I'm just going to pull up my other window here. So this one is OpenCode. You can still see it's still running through it there. So I've got an OpenCode session that I will open up here, and you can see that it doesn't do all that fun stuff. That's really not this isn't our killer app though. It's not the fact that it can just resize and be, I don't know what the people on the web call it. What's that thing where things change around? Oh, it's like it can be malleable or something. Anyway,
Responsive,
it,
dynamic.
responsive is exactly the word I was looking for. My apologies. Yeah. So, talking about a responsive TUI sounds a little bit weird, but basically as I change the size of my terminal, I'd like it to just resize, which it does do. And it's still a little bit clumsy, to be honest, but regardless. what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about OpenCode itself. So OpenCode is not a fork of Claude Code or Gemini CLI or anything like that. OpenCode is something that they built from scratch. In fact, they got offered to be purchased by Charmin and said no. And I think one of the devs joined Charmin and started to continue on this project. And then my understanding is they rewrote it from scratch. So this project is entirely written in Go for the back end. And my understanding is it's TypeScript on the front end, and they use bun packages to add functionality to it. Just like Claude Code, you've got different modes. So I'm just hitting tab here to go through different modes on the bottom left. So there's the plan that that you see in Aider, that you see in Claude Code. So basically what happens is you can go between different modes. And one of the modes that I'd added here is a code reviewer agent. And I think in Claude Code, you can do this as well. So you can add those different slash commands or different modes that you can go into. So this is nothing really new to the Claude Code users, but it is a little bit newer for the other CLI users, where this is actually pretty difficult. In fact, when we're talking about the replacement of Claude Code or maybe using this beside Claude Code, one thing that you can do is actually go through and use multiple models. So this is my segue, sir. We're finally getting to it. So you can actually go through and use that Kimi K2 that I was talking about via OpenRudder. You can use that new GPT-5 I was talking about with GitHub Copilot if you want to, or you can grab it right from the source. And I'm just going to quickly go through the list here. There's a lot of models. I'm not going to name them all, but you can get certain ones from GitHub Copilot. You can get some directly from Google, for example, with your API key. You can get, it used to be just one from OpenAI, but I think things changed this morning. So they've re-enabled some other models as well that you can go back to. And similarly, in OpenRouter, there are a ton in here. So you can go through and blacklist some of these if you don't want to see all of them, but there are a lot of different models. And the reason I mention this is for that exact use case. So right now, I think most coders would agree that Sonnet 4 is the best of most worlds. Now, it does hallucinate here and there. And one of the things that I like about GPT-5 is it seems like the hallucinations are less prevalent. Well, unfortunately, it's so slow that it means working with it is very difficult. So at the end of the day, it's really not that replacement I was hoping for. But I still ended up going down this path. And I have tried some different models like Gemini, for example, for doing things like code review, which I thought was actually quite good. So what I'm going to do here is actually swap models. So you can see on the bottom here, it says Anthropic, Claude, Sonnet, etc. So it's definitely got something in there. What we're going to do is go back to Gemini, and I'm using this from GitHub. So depending on how you're using GitHub and what your license is, you may actually be able to use models that are hosted by GitHub, or you could use something that's hosted by Google if you want to. And what I'm going to do is just say, look at this repo and give me like a feel. Like, is this repo production ready? And while it's doing it, I'll talk through a little bit of this process. But one of the things that's pretty interesting about this product is as the agents are going through, very similar to in Cloud Code, you can press Control Left and Control to sort of hop between them. So you can see what each agent is doing, which is pretty interesting. The other, and we talked about this in the preamble, is as this is working, I can actually go and share this session to a website. Now, I'll open up a share here in a moment, but basically what you can do is take this session here that I had. It was actually quite a bit faster than I thought. So that's copied to my clipboard. I'm just going to quickly open up a tab here, but we can actually follow along with the process of what's happening in a website. So I'm just going to go down here and make this not full screen. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. But I think this is one of those key features where it's something that I think Cursor is adding to Cursor CLI or has added to agent mode. Hopefully this isn't too small. We can actually see what it's doing. So we told it to use our code reviewer to go through our repo and let us know what's going on. So you can see when I started it. The nice thing here at the bottom is as well, way at the bottom here, it should actually tell us how much this cost us. This is pretty interesting. Now, the reason this is pretty interesting is because when you've got a team of people using Claude Code and they're all working together, it might be that you want to do something like share that session that got you to a feature. Maybe because you want to repeat it in the future, or if it gave you something that was incorrect, you'd like to be able to recreate this. So it's pretty cool way to share the session you've got in something like a PR. What I found was pretty interesting is as you're using that actual session, it will start scrolling through as I'm typing things, which is pretty interesting. So I wonder if I can show that here. I'm just gonna put this on one side and this on the other. Again, fantastically optimized UI here where I can resize it without waiting. But if I just did something like errors, for example. So I would expect the right-hand side to update. And you notice how quickly that happened. So I typed it in, it was almost immediate that it happened on the other side, which is pretty cool. Again, this isn't the killer app, but if you've got a team of users in these CLI apps, sharing a CLI is one of those things that's a little bit cumbersome. You can use tools like CoScreen, for example, or you could set up like an ngrok session, or maybe if you're in the video area, you could use, I think it's called ASCII Cinema or Eskinema. It's bundled together, but you can record a session and then play it back later. I feel like having this all included is actually pretty handy though. Of course, the security people are raising red flags immediately. This is a terrible idea. Totally agree. Terrible idea. If you work in the open source space, might be fine. I will say that OpenCode does have an enterprise plan if you want to like self-host it or what have you. That is there. I did look into it because the first thing in my mind is, okay, yeah, just share my source code with the world. That's
Sure.
fantastic.
Well, you've
Or
always
at
wanted to
least
be
what I'm
real.
thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I was gonna say you always want to be real careful about what you share into a repo, but now it's gonna get looks like it's gonna
Absolutely.
get blasted onto a timeline for people to notice a little easier.
Absolutely. And you don't need to, but if it's something that you want to add to maybe the authenticity of your code project or what have you, that
Yeah.
could help you out. Okay. So how did we get here? So what did they do? So I watched an interview with Dax, the creator, and basically some of these things are open source. So some of the Gemini CLI stuff is open source. So they've added some tips and tricks from there. Some of these system prompts from Claude Code were actually released by, sorry, Anthropic. So they released some of the system prompts, and then some of the ways that they're actually handling the different modes were released as well. So they've included that as part of open code. So I would say in terms of a Claude Code replacement, it feels like it's there. It's maybe not, what would you call it, lockstep with the features that they're introducing from Anthropic because they
Mm.
could add new things. But if you want to use that UI and you're worried about something, we were talking about the max plan, for example. If you don't want to pay that $200 a month, maybe you want to test how much you'd use on an open router. Look at similar comparison. You can say, how much money do I spend on open router if I didn't have a max unlimited plan? What does that look like? Of course, ignoring mistakes or the times that you put in a prompt that costs $200 on its own. We'll leave that there because I've certainly done that. I'm sure you have too. But being able to look at your team and handle that calculation across them would be good. Okay, so we talked a little bit about multimodal. It can do multimodal depending on the model. And the reason why that's important when you're designing something like a GUI is generally you want to do something like take a screenshot and see if something appeared or didn't appear. So if I want to do something like log into a website, I need to make sure the login button was there, selectable and clickable. There's a few different tests as you're going through UI testing. I say this again as somebody who knows nothing about front end, so testing is very important to me. So I need to make sure that things that I'm saying work actually work. Okay, so we talked about the modes. We talked a little bit about how you would set it up, that's that sort of thing. One of the main things that's different than this than Cloud Code is the inclusion of an LSP. Have you heard this acronym before? I can pretend like I know it, but honestly, I've never
I
did.
don't think in the context of this I have, no.
I did not either. So it's language server provider. And essentially what it is when you're running an IDE. So let's say you're editing some Python code, the language server provider will tell you basically if it's valid or if when you're typing along and then there'll be like a red thing here saying, oh, you included one too many commas in your JSON file. Or perhaps this Python code, though it looks completely valid, is absolutely not, which happens to me quite a bit. The concept, I think, in open code is that you can add multiple LSPs. I mention this because it doesn't have all language service providers. It does have a few. So it's got Python, TypeScript, JavaScript, no problem. I did notice there wasn't one there for Rust as an example. You can add your own, but by default, what it will do when you run that in it, just like you would in Cloud Code, is it'll sputter through your entire repo, figure out which LSPs need to be loaded, grab those via button is my understanding, load them up, and then as it's going through your code, making sure that it's valid, the formatting's valid, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of those things where I felt like Windsurf really shone. So it would have different plugins, different little pieces of stuff that are linting your code as you're typing, but that wouldn't necessarily be caught by a command line tool because it doesn't have those little extensions or plugins loaded. And as a result, what it can do is handle those warnings from the LSPs and deal with it as it's going through your code. Fantastic.
Okay.
The other thing that's interesting is we talked a bit about the CLI UI, but can now add this into your IDE as well, either in something like you just leave a command line and having Windsurf use it or Cursor use that command line, or they're looking at maybe using plugins or possibly a mobile app or a web app. But right now, the primary focus is the CLI. There's a bit of interaction with IDEs. It seems like it's still early days, but those are the multiple ways that you could use OpenCode going forward. So I think that covers most of the stuff. Now, there are rules, just like you'd have in Cursor. They call them instructions or rules interchangeably, but they're there. They're MCP servers. I will caution that at least the command section is a little bit different than other IDEs that you've dealt with. So instead of having command and then an args block, it's all included together. So the command is an array of the command plus the arguments. Completely different. There's an enabled section as well. Maybe I should just show off the
Yeah.
configuration here.
As you're pulling that up, just help me summarize a little bit in my head. Sounds like a good alternative for Claude Code.
Yep.
And I actually shared one with you earlier in the week called AnyClaude, which is a
Right.
project that was shared on the TLDR newsletter this week. And or maybe it was last week anyway, I looked into it, just never really had a chance to really dive into it, but I was really drawn to the idea of being able to use Claude Code or something that looked like Claude Code, but not
Right.
Codex, not Gemini, all these other nice looking CLIs, but actually Claude Code. But just experiment with some other models, especially because ChatGPT 5 had just been released and was
Right.
free for certain users over the weekend, myself included. And I just wanted to have access to that model, but within Claude Code. And sounds like I could have done that through this setup.
You got it. Yeah. So the only other thing I want to show off is just what the config looks like, because there's no GUI. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
there are a few things that you can do for themes, and all this is just a config file. Okay, I'll quickly go through it. So there's scroll speed in here at the top. There's a theme. So I've picked the theme is basically Tokyo Night, but in here, the MCP block is a little bit different. And the instruction block is a little bit different. So you can see that I've added like a code reviewer in here in terms of the agent. The instructions are basically which files would I read from, so similar to cursor rules. And then there's this schema at the bottom, just defining what the schema is. So all this to say, it's not that difficult a config file, but as usual, if you're not familiar with JSON configs, you may end up in a weird spot. I did notice in particular for me, so if you're using this on your own, you might want to bring your own MCP server or MCP endpoint if you're using SSE. A couple problems there. So SSE no longer works with the library that they're using. I think they fixed it in the version that dropped either today or yesterday. The other is, remember that the command string's a little bit different than usual. There is also a type and enabled field that need to be added. So if you're just looking at a generic MCP server, make sure you add the type. Make sure you put it enabled and have a look at your command, just so it's not command and args, but command with args, all in one array. So those are the main things about the config. So it's just different enough to trip you up, unfortunately. But once that's set up, you can do things like actually use an MCP. So if you use sequential thinking, and it can actually go through and use an MCP server for you as it's going through your code, which is pretty. I find MCP sequential thinking is one of the things I use for everything. I think the other one that you'll hear about a lot is Context 7, for example, or maybe you're using something like Playwright or Puppeteer in order to run those front-end tests that we were talking about, which is pretty handy.
Okay.
So yeah, quick review. I didn't want to go too long because I realized that once you're talking about editors, you can get sucked into the rabbit hole or down the click spiral pretty quickly. But I do feel like this is a good alternative, especially if you want to use 3 models or use a smaller model from one provider and a bigger model from Anthropic, for example. Or if you want to try out the Kimi K2s, the Quans, or what have you, the DeepSeek
Yeah.
Coder. Those are all available through OpenRouter.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I think we're all probably realizing that there's a lot of really good models out there, and some of them will get us 90% of the way, but in most cases, we're bouncing around between a few different ones. For example, the latest Opus 4.1 is really good. It had a lot of stuff, but it's so expensive. You don't need to use it for everything. I only want to use that for certain things, and then I want to switch to something else. And of course, within Claude Code, you have just default and Opus. So to have a lot more available to you is going to really open up at least some different ways of setting up your workflows that are really more probably cost conscious. And I don't know, it's not just about cost either. Like I said, there's reasons why you choose certain models, and it's nice to be able to have all of them available to you.
Absolutely. Having just watched like a podcast from Dax, I think one of the main things that they're thinking about when they talk to enterprises is if something's closed source and you can't view the open source, and that might cause some enterprises to have pause. That's a free tool, but it's not open source. I'm not too sure. The other side is if it's open source, then they want to be able to look at the code and audit it and fork it, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third is just because you're doing something in a CLI doesn't mean that the big enterprise doesn't want to actually see what's going on. So being able to have logs from your IDE actually roll up into something like a big log repository. So it just creates a log file essentially. You can tail that log. You could send it to Datadog if you want to, or some other logging form as well. But being able to grab that observability essentially from your team of AI assisted coders is pretty handy because you want to know what's actually going on in your organization, especially if you're trying to track down, like, how did this little piece of code end up in my repo? We'd love to find out the source for that and drill back. That's
Absolutely. Yeah, that changes a lot of stuff too about retrospective exercises when you go back after the fact and look at the timeline of events, what took place as you're building and as you're maintaining these systems. A lot of that's going to be in chat, and I can see consolidating all of the conversations, all of the chat into one central place being helpful for a number of reasons. Yeah, very cool.
Absolutely. Now, there's one thing I didn't cover, and this is maybe an exercise for the reader. You can add OpenCode as a GitHub, I think they're called agents or a GitHub reviewer. So you can add it to your PR process if you want to. I have not done that yet because I don't necessarily require that right now. I have used it with the GitHub command line tool, so GH, for example. That's how I do most of my PR and issue fixing. And it did, in fact, work no problem whatsoever.
All right, I appreciate you showing off some neat tools and some different ways to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So, yeah, as always, awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. Hope you enjoy it.
See you.